Let's begin with our discussion on love and sex addiction in women with our very special guest, Stacy Sprout. Stacy is a licensed psychotherapist, author, and publisher with 23 years of experience in her field. She's also a public activist promoting education about sex and love addiction and treatment options, especially for women. Beyond that, she's published her own story as a recovering addict, titled Naked in Public, a memoir of recovery from sex addiction and other temporary insanities. Love that title. Needless to say, we're very fortunate to have someone of her caliber joining us tonight. Welcome, Stacy. We're so excited that you're finally doing this with me. We've been wanting to do this for a while.
Thank you. I am delighted to be here with you, Rebecca. I really love your work.
Thank you. Likewise. Can you please describe what exactly is female sex and love addiction and how common is it?
Female sex and love addiction is what it sounds. It involves women being addicted to sex, and that might be in-person sex, it might be intrigue, it might be cyber sex, pornography, or relationships that are destructive to them in some ways. And it does involve the extreme end of the continuum. So it's not just problems in those areas. Like all addictions, it involves loss of control over what they're thinking or doing. They try to stop and they can't. They develop a tolerance, so diminishing returns, so that can lead to increased risk or intensity to try to get effect. They also can feel withdrawal if they try to stop what they're doing and almost like hangover effects, and they can have many painful consequences. So that's a key point of addiction is it gets women in trouble with themselves, they're out of integrity, their relationships, trouble with work or school, their health. These women are compromising their values. They're often living a double life and they need help, but they may not even know what's wrong. And as far as prevalence, my research is in the United States. So I am estimating there's approximately 10 million women who are struggling with sex and love addiction now. And that's about 3% of the population.
Wow. Thanks for defining that because it sounds very much like any other addiction. So certainly meets the criteria for addiction. There's so much confusion around that. So I'm very glad that you started us off with that. Now, how are female sex and love addicts different from male addicts? Are they different?
Well, classic sex addiction looks very similar for male and for females. The behaviors are the same, and but when it comes to female sex and love addiction, almost twice as many women will self-identify as love addicts or relationship addicts. So they are more likely, for many reasons, to claim that. And their problem is not as much compulsive sex as it is romance, fantasy addiction, relationship. So that is a much higher percentage than with men. I think the fastest growing group today with sex and love addiction for women is pornography addiction for young women, women under 30. That's what we're seeing. And that can bridge into cyber sex behaviors, which can become addictive. Women report obsessive fantasy as part of their sex and love addiction more than men, in my experience, more romantic fantasies, as well as more self-destructive, sexually self-destructive fantasies. And in terms of therapy, therapists typically see in women versus men more childhood trauma, more sexual abuse, more depression, more eating disorders, more concurrent alcohol use, and of course the female specific consequences regarding pregnancies and abortions, adoptions, and problems with mothering are what we see for women.
So there's lots that they're trying to escape from. It sounds like a really traumatic history, which we see in addiction anyways. And what I'm finding is with some of my female love and sex addicts, there's even trauma reenactment going on and a lot of trauma bonding. You wrote an article recently about, female porn addicts, and you were highlighting some of these, so I'm glad you mentioned that. Stacey, what happens if female sex and love addicts don't get help?
Well, some people do age out of addiction. They grow out of what's going on. But what we see, unfortunately, is that that doesn't happen for many people. So they're looking at the same painful consequences repeating over and over and over, and often escalating. So specifically for women, we see the sexual problems, the pregnancies they don't want, STIs, problems with relationships that are abusive that they can't get out of, and many more painful consequences. But they are preventable.
And that's the good thing. Treatment does help prevent that because triggers are going to be there. So the symptoms can be quiescent for the longest time, and boom, when you least expect it, they're there again. Thank you so much, Stacey, for your words of wisdom. Still ahead, more on sex and love addiction in women, 10 good reasons for having sex, and an email on orientation. So don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Sex with Rebecca, a show where we bring you expert advice on important matters to help your relationships be more intimate, exciting, and emotionally fulfilling. We've been discussing love and sex addiction in females with our very special guest, Stacey Sprout, author, therapist, publisher, media personality, and someone who's in recovery herself, so she understands it from both sides. Stacey, you are a remarkable woman, and I'm blown away by the transparency you've offered by letting us in on your own journey against sex and love addiction. So may I ask what your own recovery has looked like?
Well, I had no idea what sex addiction was until I was dating a man who told me he was a sex addict. So that was my bridge into the world of recovery. But I didn't realize I had a problem until the addiction took a more extreme turn, and I was either going to have to break up with him or do something really different. And so that's when I got into 12-step recovery for addiction in general, relationship addiction, etc., and started working on it that way.
That's a lot of work, as you and I know, the 12-step work and all the concurrent addictions, etc. So hard journey. Was it worth all that work?
Yes, absolutely. I think any woman I know in long-term recovery would say that it is worth the work, because what is your alternative if you're an addict? It's not a great future, but also because the payoff is fantastic.
That's it. The payoff is fantastic. It's interesting, a lot of the addicts that I work with initially, like yourself, they may not even be aware of it. And when we broach the subject, it's a scary label for them. And so there might be that deny, deny, deny piece. And then when they find out what recovery is going to look like, it's like, oh my God, I'll have no freedom. But the irony is the addiction takes your freedom away from you because you're doing things that you don't want to do. So great point. What is sex and love like for you now that you're in recovery?
Well, I am married, and what I want to say about my recovery with sex and love addiction is that I am honest, I am faithful, and I am wildly attracted to my husband, and I like him, and I love him, and I love to play with him, and we've built both non-erotic life of touch and snuggles, and I never had that before sexual recovery, as well as the erotic life, which anybody who says monogamy is boring, hey, it's not.
The way you said wildly attracted to him, that does not sound boring at all. And in fact, it seems like you've added another layer. So it's not like you've given up the erotic, but now the erotic is combined with other aspects. So it's true intimacy. So it definitely doesn't sound boring at all. How has being out in public with your story impacted your life?
Well, it was scary at first to post on Facebook that I was publishing my book, and most of the people there didn't know. But I've been amazed because instead of facing judgment, what I faced is people saying, hey, I think I have a problem too, or I know someone who does, or can you help my neighbor? Or so it's just given me more opportunity to carry a message that healing is possible and it's not a life sentence.
Your courage is remarkable because you were able to open up doors for others who, like yourself in the beginning, may not even have been aware that they had an issue. So what a great reward. How is your husband and family, how they reacted to all of this?
Well, my husband and I had some challenges when I was writing the book. That's a fact. And we were committed to working through them. I couldn't have done it without his support. And my family was also very important when I launched the book. In fact, I have a video on my author Facebook page detailing the story of writing the book. It was my sister who introduced me and talked about what it was like to have sex addiction in the family.
Wow.
So I've been very lucky.
So very supportive family, and I think that's such an important part of recovery. And the sad thing is, what I find, and certainly you see as well, when we don't have a supportive partner, it's another layer that the person has to deal with. So I encourage people whose partners in recovery to help them, because the rewards are worth it for both sides. Now, Stacey, I admire your knowledge and courage beyond words. You inspire me every day with your dedication to fighting this tough fight. When we return, we'll be hearing more from Stacey and discussing 10 good reasons for healthy sex. So stay with us. Welcome back to Sex with Rebecca, a show geared towards making your relationships the best they can be, both in and out of the bedroom. We've been discussing sex and love addiction in women with a remarkable healer, Stacey Sprout, who herself is in recovery and has made it her mission to educate people in this often misunderstood area. Stacey, do sex and love addiction always go hand in hand in women?
No. Women, in fact, a young woman recently said, I'm a porn addict. I'm not a sex addict. There's a difference. And as I said, almost twice as many women identify as love addicts than sex addicts. There are stigma issues, but for many women, once we get into their story, there's overlapping issues. So,
And I think what I'm finding too is a lot of times initially they might just identify with love addict, because even when it comes to an affair, a lot of the women, they try to justify it because of the emotional piece. And then when it comes down to it, might look just like any other affair without that gender difference. So I guess it's all over the map. Now, are there other addictions which can also coexist?
yes, coexisting addictions are quite common for female addicts. And sadly, as you touched on, the more abuse or neglect a girl has suffered, the more likely she is to have multiple addictions. So
Mm-hmm.
we see food addiction, codependency, spending, romance, sex addiction. Approximately 83% of sex addicts report multiple addictions.
Wow. And I know Patrick Carnes had said that the more addictions we see, the better indicator it is that they had a lot more abuse. So the more abuse, the more addictions. So that's sort of a way of tapping into that. And I find a lot of my female clients in recovery often struggle with attachment issues. And like you mentioned, some are codependent. On top of everything else that they're dealing with, have you discovered any concurrent issues beyond the concurrent addictions in the population that you treat?
Well, especially attachment for female sex and love addicts is profoundly impaired.
Mm-hmm.
One study by Kelly McDaniel, who wrote Ready to Heal for female sex and love addicts, talked about 30 addicts who identified no attachment to their mothers, and they related as sex addicts. And then 30 who said they had an anxious attachment to their mothers, and they related more as love addicts. So it's all connected.
And it makes sense if you look at the insecure, anxious attachment style, where it's so hard to buy that you love because you've seen the parental love all over the map. There's no consistency. So when you're with someone, you just need to be fed that, I love you, I love you, I love you. And still, it doesn't seem to be enough. Um, you've you have your wealth of knowledge, and since we barely touched the tip of the iceberg here, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your new book so our audience can learn more about you and from you. Tell us what inspired you to write it.
Well, so Naked in Public, it's my own story of recovery. And I wrote it for two reasons. One is I felt an inspiration. I just felt like I had to do it. And another is I almost died because of my addiction. And I thought, I could just sail off and pretend like nothing happened, but I'd like to use all that pain to try to help others. So that's why I wrote it.
So you got a second lease on life, and you wanted to make sure that you made the most of it. What will our audience find in your book, Stacey? Perhaps you could give us like a bit of a synopsis.
Sure. So the book starts with my childhood and growing up in a family with concurrent addictions and abuse. I tried not to be too scary and just say what happened. Then I moved into my life and as a young woman, how I tried to find love and happiness and how it didn't go very well. And that led me into recovery. And then the third part of the book is about what recovery looks like and how I was able to learn to make friends, learn to make connections, and ultimately how I met my husband. And it has a happy ending.
And that's the most important thing, that it has a happy ending, which is very, very encouraging, because you've sort of looked at it from both sides as a therapist as well as someone in recovery. So what a richly textured landscape to be able to help people. Before we wrap up, are there any key messages or words of wisdom that you'd like to leave our audience with on sex or love addiction for either males or females?
I would say that shame is such a key part of the addiction. And the truth is, people are amazing inside. Addiction can cover that up. But if you have a problem, get help. You're worth it. Healing is happening. Healing is, more and more resources are coming out all the time. And, and people are waiting to support you.
That's such great advice. And lots of people think that that label is so scary, and people think that it's a moral or a characterological issue, and it's not. I work with so many addicts who are absolutely lovely people. They're very caring people, and the partner almost always says that, okay, if you cared about me, why did you do that? And they don't appreciate the contradictions that can occur. Do you have a quick comment on that?
Well, speaking for myself, there was so much pain. The only moral I had was to get out of pain.
Hmm.
So it was very self focused. And then I did hurt people in the process. But once I was able to get help and get out of pain, I think my true character was able to come out. And I see that with addicts all the time.
Absolutely, and I think that's a good point, that the addict is very much in pain, because lots of people say, oh, they're just using that as a label to get away with cheating or something like that, and it's not an easy label. And I always tell people, why would they want that label? Because of all the pain that it implies. Stacy, thank you so very much for all your remarkable insights. I hope that you've inspired people in our audience who maybe weren't sure, were on the fence, to really look into treatment, and of course catch your podcasts and look at your book and be inspired by it. Thank you so much.
You are welcome. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure.